Hi, welcome back to Play Chess, second in our series. And let's get right down to business and review quickly what we did last week. Remember how we set up the board. The board was set up so that the white square is on your right-hand side. And we set up the pieces, the white pieces down here, the black pieces up here. Always remember that the queen, if you have the white pieces, the queen goes on the white square, the black queen goes on the black square. Remember, we referred to diagonals as being these slanted columns along the board. We referred to the files and to the ranks. And our pieces were the rooks, the knights, the bishops, the king, the queen bishop, the queen knight, the queen rook. And in front of each of these pieces we had the pawns or the infantrymen. And that's the way our board was set up. Now, how the pieces move. Remember, we said that the pawns move straight ahead, one square at a time, until they reach the 8th rank, in which case you can promote it to a queen, if you're lucky enough to get it up there. However, on the first move of each pawn, if you want, you can move it 2 squares. So you have a choice on the first move for each pawn, either of 1 square forward or 2 squares forward. Now, the rooks. Remember how they move? The rooks move, if there's nothing in the way, they move along the file or along the ranks as many squares as you want to move it. And the knight is a piece that can jump over other pieces, and providing the square it wants to land on is vacant. In this case, it can go to F3. It always goes from a black to a white. If it's on a white, it will end up on a black. You move the knight 2 and 1, or 2 and 1. Let's look at that again. If the knight is over here on H3 on a white square, it's going to land on a black square. Let's look at what it won't be on these 2 black squares, but we have these 2 we can go to. 2 and 1, like an L shape, 2 and 1. From this square, the knight can move also in an L shape. We look for the white squares now because it's starting from a black. The knight can move down 2 and over 1. It can move over 2 and 1. Always 2 and 1, and always ending up on a square of a different color. That's the knight. The bishop, remember we said the bishop, if it starts out on the white square, will be on the white square for the rest of the game. The bishop can move only on the diagonal. That's why it has to stay on the square it's on. As many squares as you want to move it. That is, you can't make a turn. If you want to get to this square, it will take 2 moves. 1, and your next move, 2. But the bishop moves on the diagonal. And I'd like to remind some students have trouble with the bishops. Think of the slanted crevice in the hat of the bishop, in the mitre. It's in a slanted position, and that'll remind you how the bishop moves. So you have 1 bishop on the white square, 1 bishop on the black square. Together they cover the entire board. And because the rook goes straight up and straight across, it covers all colors of the board. Therefore, it's more powerful than the bishop, which is limited to only half the board. The king. The king, we said, can move in any direction, 1 square at a time. So this king can move to any of these squares at each move. It can go here, or it can go here, or here. And always remember, a king cannot move into a square that is being attacked. So if we have a bishop, this bishop is here and attacking the black diagonal, the king cannot move into check. Remember, we said check is when we attack the enemy king, we say check. The king cannot move into where it can be taken. It is impossible in chess to move your king onto a square that is being attacked. So the king can move in any direction, 1 square at a time. The queen, on the other hand, can move in any direction, as many squares as you would like to move her. Therefore, she's the most powerful on the board. You might say that the queen is the most powerful piece in the army, but the king, which is limited in scope as to how it moves, is indispensable because you cannot lose your king. So, and we refer to the board as having a king side and a queen side. So this would be the king bishop, this would be the queen bishop, the king knight, the king rook. This pawn would be called the king bishop pawn, because this one would be the queen bishop pawn, king bishop pawn, king knight pawn, king rook pawn. And we have the ranks numbered from 1 to 8, and the files, which go up and down, are lettered from A to H. So if I want to move this pawn in the opening, I would simply put on my scorecard pawn E2, that's E2 to E4. And if my knight were to come out up 2 and over 1 to this square, from black to white, I would say knight from G1 to F3. G1 to F3. This is the way we denote our moves. This bishop can come out on the diagonal. I would write down bishop F1 to C4. It's very simple. Anyone can follow that. And you can keep score of your game. You can have white on one side of your score sheet, black on the other side, to put down both moves, and then you can play your games over afterwards, which is very useful, especially if you lose the game. You can play them over to see why you lost, and of course if you win the game, you want to show people how you've won it. Now, something new in the basic rules that we haven't touched on yet, and that was how to capture an enemy piece. Well, if this bishop is out here and it can go on the diagonal, and if it's white's move, the bishop would move in the sense it does diagonally, and it captures the enemy piece by occupying the same square. We said that last week, but there was one piece we didn't mention as to how it captures, and that's the pawn. Whereas all the other pieces on the board capture according to the way they move, the pawn is an exception. Two pawns facing each other are immobile. They're fixed. You would think this pawn could take this pawn because pawns move straight ahead. But that's the exception. Pawns can only capture another piece by going one square diagonally. So this pawn can only move if it captures this pawn. And that's the only time a pawn will ever leave its home file. Each pawn has a home file. This is the H pawn, the G pawn, the F pawn, named after the files. Now here's the E pawn. The E pawn can stay where it is, and you can move another piece, or you can capture by going one square diagonally. In this case, the queen now, if it's black's move, the queen, which can move in any direction, can move right up and take that pawn, and you have what we call an exchange of pawns. Let's put this back again and we'll study that. Let's say it's black's move in this position. The pawns are facing each other. They can only capture by moving off their file by going diagonally. It's black's move. Black cannot move the king pawn. It's fixed. However, the queen pawn has a choice of two moves. The queen pawn can either advance one square, according to its customary motion, or can capture white's pawn by moving one square diagonally. Now try and keep that in mind. It's very important, because one of the most important aspects of the game when we get into discussing strategy is the pawn structure of the game. The pawn structure, the relative positions of one pawn to another, is the pawn skeleton, and it dictates how we judge the position of the game. But we'll be coming to that. Just remember that pawns capture by moving off their home file, by moving one square diagonally. In this position, white has a choice of either taking this pawn or that pawn, but cannot move. These two pawns are fixed as such. Now, one other interesting thing we haven't discussed is called en passant, which means in passing. Remember I said last week that the game, when it started in India, Persia, India, that area, the pawns could only move one square at a time. Well, when they changed that rule a few hundred years ago to allow it to move 2 squares, if you wanted to, on their first move, someone said, well, that's not fair, because what happens if black has a pawn advanced this far? See, part of the theory of the game is that each pawn will eventually meet 2 pawns that can capture it, because pawns take diagonally. So each pawn has 2 pawns on adjacent files that are potential captors of it. Now, if I've advanced this pawn this far, and white now moves the king pawn up 2, according to the new rule, he has bypassed the threat of being captured. So the innovators of this 2-move maneuver said, well, we can't allow that to happen. It changes too much the theory of the game. So what we'll do is this. If this pawn does move 2 moves, we shall allow black to capture it just as though it has moved once, or 1 move. You follow that? So if white comes up to e4, this pawn can capture by going en passant, we call it in French, in passing. We capture that pawn just as though it has moved 1 square. So that the en passant rule means that the old strategy of chess still persists, that each pawn is faced with the task of meeting 2 enemy pawns on adjacent files. Again, let's look at it this way. If I have a pawn on the 5th rank, if white has a pawn in the 5th rank, and black moves pawn d7 to d5, if I want, I can capture by going 1 square diagonal, just as though it has moved 1 square, as it did in the old days of chess. I capture en passant. But remember this, I must capture immediately on that move. If I allow it to stay and make another move, on my next move I can't capture it. I have to take en passant immediately, or it stays like that. You can only capture en passant on the move. Not many people who play chess, who aren't serious chess players, understand this en passant maneuver, but it's very important. Another rule that we haven't touched, and this is the only other basic rule we haven't touched, has to do with what we call castling. We'll take these pieces off. Let's say the pawn structure looks something like this. Forget about black's moves. And white has the pieces out here somewhere. So if you want, I'll set up a little position to make it more realistic. Okay. Forget about black's position. Now, it's white's move. White has not moved his king. He has not moved his rook. He is not in check. And these squares are not attacked by any enemy piece. We can now castle kingside, which in effect is this. We move the king over 2 squares, and we bring the castle beside it. That's all done in 1 move. It's called castling kingside. Here again, we haven't moved the king. If the king is moved up and back again, we can't castle any longer. We move the king over 2, bring the castle beside it, castling kingside. Let's look at the other side. We can also castle queenside, but the end result is a little bit different. We still move the king over 2 squares, and we bring the castle beside it. That's castling queenside, but you notice there are 2 squares left here, whereas in this position it was tucked in with only 1 square left. Now, why do we castle? What's the purpose of it? Well, one of the big problems in chess is to get your rooks working together. Rooks are very strong when they can maneuver together. So, one way of doing it is to castle. And now our rooks can come and occupy files where it thinks there will be pawn exchanges. You see, as soon as some pawns vanish, and these files become very active for the rooks. So you develop your pieces, try and bring your rooks together, position them on files where you think there will be pawn exchanges, and you're all set to invade the enemy territory. So that's one reason for castling. Another reason for castling on either side is to tuck your king into a corner where it can't be as easily attacked by the enemy. If you leave the king in the center of the board, it's very vulnerable to a smashing attack to the center. So not only do you want to get all your pieces into play, and one way is by castling, but you also get your king tucked into a safe spot. So we have king-side castling, and we have queen-side castling. Now, I hope that you remember most of the maneuvers we showed before. I've just reviewed them. What is new this week has been the en passant maneuver, the castling procedure, and the capturing of pawns. The game of chess is divided into three sections. We talk about an opening, a middle, and an end. There's the opening game, the mid game, and the end game. The opening game is mainly to get your forces out into the battlefield. The mid game, we are concerned with tactics and strategy. And the end game are when most pieces have been exchanged off and we're left with perhaps just a couple of pieces, the kings and a few pawns. Now, in each of these three categories, we have a different set of theories to study and to become acquainted with. Briefly, let me give you an example of what would an ideal opening position be. I won't bother with black's moves. Let's just look at white's moves. Ideally, and as I said last week, to centralize your pieces, the center of the board, is to make them more powerful. They have more scope. Remember, power in chess is equated with mobility. The more mobile a piece is, the more powerful it is. You open up the two center pawns. Now remember, pawns can capture on squares that are diagonally in front of it. So these two little pawns, right away, cover all of these four squares in the center. So if I put a knight here, if black puts a knight there, it can be captured. Or here. You see? Or here. Or here. That knight can be taken. So what these two pawn moves mean is that the center has been robbed. White has robbed black from allowing any major piece to come into the center, or they'll be captured. Not only are these good moves from that point of view, but they also open up the bishops towards the center. Ideally, we bring out our knights before our bishops, always towards the center, up 2 and over 1. Now you notice that's not just developing a knight, but it's also 2 and 1 protecting a center pawn, so that if that pawn is taken, this knight can retake and end up in the center, even more centralized. And the other knight can come out here. The bishops can come out towards the center on the diagonal. Now we're ready for castling. Bring the king over 2, and the castle beside it. Now we can bring the queen up just 1 square. Now a lot of beginners will invariably try and bring their queen out very early in the game. I must caution you against it. Keep your rooks and your queen back in the game until there are open lines for them to work on. If you try to bring them out and get what we call cheap mates early in the game, and you're playing good players, you're going to end up losing the game very quickly, because they can be attacked very readily by black developing pieces and attacking her, and you don't want to lose the queen, and she'll be running all around the board trying to escape attack while the other pieces are being developed. Okay? After the queen comes out, you can centralize your rooks, and everything's working towards the center. Now this we would call an ideal situation. Naturally, your opponent is not going to allow this to happen. Your opponent will also be thrusting pieces out towards the center. But if he allows any of these moves, make these moves towards the center, and you will end up with a good game. Now the theory in the opening, of course, and the different openings that are available to us, the theories are concerned with how black is to prevent white from achieving that position, and how white is going to try to dupe black into going astray. White has a small advantage in the game of chess because it has the first move. We call this having the tempo. White is up one tempo in the game. If white should lose that tempo, then we say that black has equalized as far as time is concerned. Now, what you should really do, let's turn to our board over here, which is where I've left the pieces off. I want you to study your basic elementary checkmates. The basic mates. If we have just our kings left in the board, I want you to study your queen and king against the king. Now you can play these at home. You can set them up anywheres at all on the board. Set them up anywheres, and you can play both sides. The idea is to try and figure out how to force this king back to the end of the board, to the end position which you have in your mind as white. You want to be able to either end up in this position, which is checkmate. We're checking the king. The king cannot go here, 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 here because of the queen. King cannot capture the queen because two kings can never be together. They cannot move into check. And so that's a checkmate. This is a checkmate we showed last week, where the queen can come down, check on the rank, and remember the king cannot move out in this position because the king is attacking all these squares. That's a checkmate. This would also be a checkmate because of the power of the queen to go in the diagonals. So learn this. This is your very basic mate. King and queen against the king. Learn how to do it. Learn how to force the king back. Quick example would be something like this. We move here. We say check. The king has to come back. We come up with the king. See, we've kept this rank with the queen. The king moves. Anytime the king moves in front of the white king, move in with a check. Now, if that were the edge of the board, it would be checkmate. Right? But he can move away. If he moves away, follow him up. It's no good to simply say check again because he can come out again. Follow him up. If he moves back, grab the rank in front. He moves in here, you move here. If he moves here, you move here. He can't go there on the queen. He has to go there, and you have a checkmate either here, checkmate here, or checkmate here. So you force the king back. So you can set up this with your boards at home. It's the very basic mate, the queen and the king against the king. Now we can substitute the rook instead of the queen. If we have the rook can come down, and that's also a checkmate. And the king cannot come out for the same reasons. But realize that is not a checkmate, because the king can go diagonally, can go here because the castle or the rook cannot move diagonally. Right? Cannot move. So, whereas a queen, that would be a checkmate. With a rook, that isn't. With a rook, it's checkmate this way. Now, there are also, you can checkmate with the king and two bishops. This is a checkmate. You can also checkmate with a knight and a bishop, like so. So remember, these are your basic mates. The king and the queen against the king. A rook and a king against the king. Two bishops and a king. Or a knight and a bishop and a king. And we'll discuss with our next program some of the mates that you might think you'll be able to get, but you can't. And we'll wait till then. Now, in the meantime, if you have any questions, you can write to Play Chess, care of Box 7025, Station A, St. John, New Brunswick. Thanks.